welcome to the NRFC 2021 virtual event, Last Discussion Session, Providing Trauma-Informed Care to Low-Income Fathers.
You see certain things get reincarnated in your children. My daughter is very much inspired by my wife's artistic pursuits. So my daughter started making necklaces. She makes what we call affirmation fashion. I tell her every day that your black is beautiful. Your black is beautiful. Your black is beautiful. And if there's anything better than being beautiful, it's being smart. And if there's anything better than being smart, it's being kind. And reaffirming that every day is our method of making sure her chin never drops. My dad wasn't around. And I remember riding a bike and falling off and cutting myself, and me never just wanting to get back on it. People ask, how your children learn how to ride a bike, and you didn't. I didn't teach them. I just created an environment where they taught themselves, and all I had to do was be there.
This and other videos are available on the Fatherhood YouTube page, including our Fatherhood Dad jokes. You can also follow us on other social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And now I will turn it over to Stacey Boucher from the NRFC.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our final session. It's been quite the 2 days, and we are going to finish strong. I promise you that. You will not be disappointed. I'm going to just start by introducing myself. I'm part of the NRFC team, and in some disclosure, as Dr. Brown recommended, I will say I'm a trauma survivor and who has sought services, so I do have a particular interest in this topic. And our two experts with us today are Joseph T. Jones. Joe is the founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Urban Families in Baltimore, Maryland, which is where I am too. Thank you for tolerating my Baltimore accent. Joe has escaped that somehow, but I haven't. Our other presenter is Dr. Samantha Wolfson, who is a senior research associate at MDRC, which is a research and think tank, and one of our partners at the Clearinghouse. And Samantha also is a clinical psychologist in a former life, so she has some particularly good insights to offer as well. Before we jump into the content, Joe has picked the icebreaker for our session. And I am going to ask all of you to share in the chat box, what is your favorite movie or television show, past or present, with a fatherhood theme? What is your favorite movie or television show, past or present, with a fatherhood theme? And Joe, would you like to tell us yours?
Sure. Hey, good to be with you, Stacey and Sam. And hello, everybody. Yes, my favorite all time is really a present story. It airs on Netflix. I think it just finished its third season. It's kind of wholesome, so you can watch it with your kids. It's called All American. And it's about this young man who's a football player in high school, and he's really a stellar player. His father is in his life, but then his father dies, and the other kids have different relationships with their father. And it's just a really, really great story. It's uplifting, although it's prickly, just as the work that we do serving fathers in community.
And Joe, can you just tell us a little bit about your work while you're sharing?
Yeah, so many others, I come to this work out of personal experience, having grown up without my dad. And when he left, I kind of spiraled out of control. My life spiraled out of control, largely because of the bad choices that I made, including having a son out of wedlock myself that I largely wasn't responsible for. But on the rebound, I was very, very fortunate that a lot of people supported my transformation, including an opportunity to work in the Baltimore City Health Department in maternal and child health. And we were working to reduce infant mortality, focused solely on identifying pregnant women, helping them to have a healthy birth. And the health department had no interest, no awareness, no focus on serving dads. I lifted this up because I kept running into the dads. Eventually, I was able to convince them to allow me to start a small fatherhood program that kind of evolved over time. We added a workforce component to it. And then I left the health department to create the Center for what was then called the Center for Fathers, Families, and Workforce Development, which is a long way to say be careful what name you choose. But important to note, in addition to the work that we've done historically around social and economic mobility, getting dads and their family members connected to jobs within a whole family context, when we rebranded the organization in 2007, we rebranded it to the Center for Urban Families, and we were very, very intentional about making sure that fathers were intentionally included in what we do. So we added the tagline, helping fathers and families work, and that tagline is on the facade of our building. We wanted to make sure that as fathers went through the community, they walked by, they knew that this was a place for families, but it also was keenly available to them that this was a place for dads as well. And so that's how I got to the work, and really, glad to be with you all to talk more about this work, particularly as it relates to trauma.
Thanks, Joe. And I just want to add I know there's been a lot of new people to fatherhood that have joined us over the past 2 days. Joe's too humble to say this, but he is a national figure in this work. He's a pioneer. He's one of the first to have really done it and done it well. And he spends just countless hours working and talking and providing his program in Baltimore as a national model to effectively serve fathers. And he's just a beautiful heart and soul person. I love you, Joe. So
I love you back, Stacey, and thank you for your contributions to the field and the work that you did with women in fatherhood to add a sister voice to the work that we've been doing. So it's great to be here.
My pleasure. Thank you. Okay, now that all the love fest is done, Sam, I love you too. I don't want you to feel left out. Can you answer our icebreaker and tell us about your work?
Of course. So the movie I instantly thought of came out of the 80s, Kramer versus Kramer, and I always loved it because it just highlights and illustrates a really beautiful father-little boy relationship and how it grows and emerges over time. And my interest in fatherhood came about when I was in graduate school, and I was in part of the program was child development, and there was always this big emphasis on mothers, and I always thought, what about the dads? So I always had a kind of intellectual research interest in it, and also was lucky. I'm grateful to have had a great dad myself, and so that's something that has boosted me throughout my life. And then my clinical work is really focused on early childhood and working with kids who had parents and dads who were incarcerated or tried to be, maintain relationships, and try to kids who had experienced trauma and a lot of stress. So that's the trauma lens that I bring. And more recently at MDRC, I've been working both on the research side and the TA side with HMRF programs. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm really excited to see, I'm looking at all the ideas of movies. I have a movie list that I keep, so I'm gonna get those and add them to my movie list. So
yes. Oh, I see that you guys are coming up with great ones. Father of the Bride, I love that. I guess I'll share my favorite fatherhood movie is related to my daughter, who was obsessed with Daddy Daycare. She watched that movie hundreds of times, and there's a little Flash Gordon character in there, and she had a Flash Gordon costume she wouldn't take off for weeks. But yeah, Eddie Murphy, really, I love that movie. So that's what I always think of when I think of my favorite. But so let's get into the content. Sam, why don't you start us off and let us know what is the definition of trauma, and what type of trauma and adverse childhood experiences have low-income fathers faced?
So I think the key aspect of trauma is that at its core, it's a feeling of unsafety and potentially threat to your life, it's outside the norm of experience. And it can be a single event, it can be a series of events, it could be a situation or circumstance that an individual is in. And it affects the individual at all levels. It can affect you physiologically, emotionally, physically, even your spiritual well-being can be affected. And I also want to add that it's not just at an individual level, but it can also be multi-generational, or it can be kind of experience generational trauma transferred potentially from a parent or family to children, or trauma experience that's experienced by specific cultural or racial or ethnic groups. We've seen this happening nationally, internationally. And the way to think about it is just think of 3 E's, and this comes out of SAMHSA. And it's the event itself, how the individual experiences the event, and then what the effects of the event are. So for one person, they might experience an event differently, and the effect will be different. So it's going to be individualized based on people. You could put 3 people into the same circumstances and you'll see it differently. And I think given Joe's work, we'll be able to hear more about what it looks like in the real world. So I will.
Yes, Joe, the dads you serve, what have been their trauma experiences?
You know, when Sam was talking about these different levels of trauma, I see it, similar to hers and somewhat nuanced, in terms of the individual level, but also the community level, right? Baltimore is like many urban communities, is a very gritty town, right? An example of the context in which our dads have to work through to be parents and to be caregivers and to be, financial contributors. We're located, for geographical references, we're located in Baltimore, what's known as zip code 21217. And 21217 is the community where Freddie Gray lived and died while in police custody. And just within that one zip code alone, we have about 2,800 non-custodial parents, primarily men, but some moms as well, who owe an aggregate of $28 million in back child support just for that one particular zip code. That zip code also happens to have the largest concentration of people that come back from incarceration from any zip code in the state of Maryland. And it also has a relatively high poverty, not relatively, has a high poverty rate of 35%. So when you think about that context alone, the struggle that you have to go through on a day-to-day basis, trying to be a provider, not knowing where you can get help. We don't have enough fatherhood programs around to serve the need in our country, and definitely not in a community like Baltimore. And so dads are trying to work through that, and oftentimes they're trying to work this on their own, right? So they don't have the luxury of getting up and say, I want to walk to a fatherhood program. So for us, it's about the reverse of that, going out into the community, touching them where they are, to let them know, hey, here's a set of services. Help us to understand what you're grappling with. You talk to somebody on a corner and a car goes by at a high rate of speed, the nervousness associated with that, because they fear it might be a gunshot, right? The likelihood that you can get a job and keep the income you earn because you got outstanding child support debt is another kind of nuanced issue surrounding trauma, where you're constantly being bombarded with messages you need to be financially responsible, but you don't have the capability of being financially responsible because, one, it's difficult with the kind of barriers that you have to get into the labor force. And if you do get into the labor force and you owe that kind of debt, that it's a high likelihood that your paycheck is going to be garnished or a lien will be placed on your bank account. And so we take these things very, very seriously. And what does it mean, not just from a practitioner standpoint, but what does it mean from a policy standpoint? How do you engage these systems? How do you engage legislators and other civic and business leaders to make the case for it? One of the best ways I know that you can turn around crime in a community is you get dads and you support them so their children stay out of trouble, right? Yeah. Stay in school, on track to finish on time without, these episodes of dropping out of school. And if you do that long term, and you do it consistently with the kind of investments that ACF is making in fatherhood programs. But we need much more investment in those areas to reverse the trend around trauma and the things that we see with dads in a community like Baltimore.
That's a good point. That came out loud and clear when Joe and I did the Parenting in a Violent World years ago at CFUF. Yes, if fathers are involved, it makes a big difference. And we also know from research that 3 out of 5 men in this country have experienced or witnessed at least one traumatic event in their lives, but they are often reluctant to seek help because they equate that with being dependent or vulnerable. I want to put a question to the audience now. What types of trauma and adverse childhood experiences have the fathers you served experienced? If you could share that with us, I would appreciate it. All right, question 2. So we know that trauma always leads to a fight, flight, freeze response. What a lot of people don't know is that this response continues running like a car engine, idling but not in gear. A little bit of adrenaline continues to power the body. So as if it's expecting to suddenly shift back into that fight, flight, freeze gear. Joe, we'll start with you. What does it mean for fathers to be living in a chronic state of survival mode, to constantly have that survival mechanism activated?
I think about this, in terms of all of us in society. So all of us represent human beings who have different life experiences. I don't think there's anybody that I know of that hasn't had to have some rebound, hasn't had to be resilient. Maybe it's overcoming something as simple as like test anxiety, right? For you to be able to excel academically. But when you are in a constant state of having to be resilient all the time, 24/7, you don't get to take your foot off the accelerator, right? Every minute is a constant, sense of what can I do next to get out of the situation I'm in? What can I do next to be a better parent? What can I do to get the job that I just can't get? What can I do to get the housing that is not available to me, right? Most of us have an opportunity to take a vacation, whether it's a staycation or we go to some destination of our choice. We get a chance to get away from this from time to time. When you don't have the ability to get away, to take a break, it is toxic, right? I'm not a clinical person, so I would defer to Sam on this, but I know, for example, in a community like it's called Roland Park, which is 10 minutes away from the community of Sandtown where Freddie Gray lived, the life expectancy for men is 10 years different, right? And so it shaves minutes, days, weeks off of your life expectancy, right? And so to recognize the fact that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, I know, in terms of how people present, but we have to recognize that the kind of interventions that we did before we really thought more about trauma have to be trauma informed today. We've got to make sure that we're prepared to work with a population of human beings who are facing some insurmountable odds, and you can't expect a person to live psychologically, physically in that state all the time. So what does it mean for us to be more trauma informed and to think about the ways that we engage people who present, knowing that when they come in with a suitcase, their suitcase is likely to have stuff in it that's much different from the stuff we have in our own suitcases.
Thanks. Samantha, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking about it, I think as you have people come into your office, into your programs, and from at least a physiological perspective, 2 things are happening. One is they've got stress hormones, as you mentioned, running through their bodies, and cortisol, adrenaline, and that has an effect on your health. It takes a toll. So there's all kinds of risks. There's research that shows that it can contribute to high blood pressure. It can cause, and I'll talk about a little bit more about the brain, but potentially, deposits in your arteries, potentially chronic illness, heart disease, even maybe cancer. So physiologically, it's really takes a toll. And then at a brain level, the way as I think of it, so if you're in a fight, flight, or freeze, this is happening in the brain. And if you think about it, I use this, borrow this from a colleague who shared this with me, where this is your brain, and here's your brain stem, and this is the part of the body that's really activated during a trauma event. It controls your heartbeats and your breathing and all the stuff that puts you into that. And even talking about it, I can feel myself feeling that kind of constriction of breathing. And then in here, what happens is you've got your feeling part of the brain, the amygdala, and then here's the prefrontal cortex, and that's the part of your brain that thinks rationally and is able to problem solve. So if you're in a constant fight, flight, or freeze, so it's not all of those, you might be ready to put up your dukes because you're feeling threatened, or you might be I can't pay attention to anything you're saying, or I'm getting out of here. I'm not staying for this session. So those are all things that are happening. And so we'll talk more about what can you do to help get that brain back to this place so you can support dads to identify goals for themselves and think about what they're going to do next to help themselves and help their families.
Great, thank you. I just want to remind participants too that if you go to the agenda and this session, there's a PDF of the PowerPoints, and I think it's PowerPoint, it's pages 8 and 9 show our graphical representations of the effects of trauma. As Joe articulated, early death is one of them. And also, in addition to this, the physiological effects, trauma leads to risky behaviors often. There's a correlation with substance abuse. So take a look at those slides. Be sure to download those resources. So for the next question, I want to ask you both, how does past trauma affect fathers in the present? How does it affect how they parent? How does it affect how they present themselves in programs? And how successful they are in meeting program goals and compliance? Joe, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, it's having done this work for a couple of decades plus now. First of all, let me give homage to folks who've helped to support the work we've done at the center. Folks like James Worthy, folks like Vernon Wallace and Moses Hammett and Johnny Rice, and I'm sure I'll leave some folks out, but I want to lift up the fact that we've had some stellar practitioners who have been on the grind helping to do this work in Baltimore and elsewhere. And we are built as an organization to understand where we're located, right? And that means that the people who come into our organization, whether they walk in or we go out and touch them to encourage them to come in, they represent what's going on in the community. And I've talked about some of the data points related to, relative to where we serve. So that you're going to get all kind of experiences come in, and we're built to understand and expect that we're going to get dads to come in with a whole lot of energy. And sometimes that energy is mute, and sometimes it's a little boisterous and over the top. And so we are set up to understand that people are going to come in with those type of experiences, and we can't overreact to it. We have to understand that that's how it's going to be and to calm the situation. So for me, the very first principle and value in our organization is respect. Independent of how somebody else shows up, we will always respond back to them with respect. And if you do that consistently, people tend to feel more at home and begin to disarm themselves, right? And to be honest with you, in the 20 plus years I've been doing this, we've never had a physical altercation in our building, right? And so they come in and we have to, encourage them to breathe sometimes, just basic breathing tenets. To say, okay, we got you. Breathe a little bit. And I've also had to work with my team over the years to say, we do have to collect information. We do have to collect data. If you have a federal fatherhood grant, you know what I'm talking about, right? And then beyond that, right? And so you can't be in compliance mode all the time. You've got to be able to assess the situation, say, you know what, this is a dad, even though I need to have this form completed, I need to have this information populated. I've got to take a step back and really do more engaging at this particular point and over time, because dads come with the sense that, I don't even know if I actually want to be here. And the way that we socialize men in our society, to be providers and protectors, to go to work and go to war, we've not necessarily said to dads, we want you to be a nurturer. That's happened more so, in recent times. But we have to understand that the beauty of somebody walking in the door is gold. Just walking in the door is gold. And then if you can get to know them, and particularly as they go through the process and get you, and I want people to really understand this, not necessarily practitioners, because I know practitioners get this, but for policymakers, for those program administrators, having something like a support group, a dedicated space where guys can come in with other guys like them and to feel safe. Coming back to Sam's point around feeling safe, the beauty of what comes out in support groups allow you to capture information qualitatively that will help you to get to know a person better. So when you get back to your assessments, you start getting true, honest information that will allow you to create the kind of goal plans with them. It's their plan, it's not yours. So you shouldn't be the one telling them what they're going to do, right? And that is, I think, some of the basic tenets around, using respect, creating a community of trust, creating sanctuary within an organization, within community, where dads can not only feel that way themselves, but when they go out in the community, they talk about that place that they came to as being a place that's safe for others. And I think those are some of the things I would say to folks that are embedded in what you think about in trauma. That's not necessary, because guys aren't going to come in and say, look, I'm traumatized. I need mental health. That's just not going to happen. So we got to think about how do we understand that from their context.
I was just thinking that you told me once, like, the word trauma has never passed the lips of these men, right? So they don't understand it. And they certainly don't understand how their pasts many times are affecting their presence. Yeah. And you and James Worthy have told me several times, like, when the men walk in the door, it's not about asking them what they need help with. The fact that they walked in tells you that they need something, right? So it doesn't even need to be pointed out. But Sam, what would you like to share?
I'm thinking about this word respect and connecting it also to empathy and realizing, I think, we're talking about what are the effects of trauma? What does it look like? And people might be saying, all right, well, what do I do about this? But I think the first step is in understanding what the experiences might be like for the dads. I saw somebody had shared they had their own experiences. So you've been in those shoes, or if you haven't, to try to take a step back and think, all right, somebody's coming in and there might be some kind of he's not showing up to a session, or something's going on. Whatever that thing is that you might experience as some kind of pushback on the services, to take a step back and think, well, something else might be going on for this dad. There might be the consequences of trauma will play out in behavior. It'll play out in how people react emotionally. Because if you think back to that kind of brain picture, somebody might be more reactive. They might have a toddler who's having a tantrum, and it's harder you have to stay calm with a toddler. And if you're in constant fight and flight, that makes it even harder to be supportive of a toddler. Or somebody's asking you, fill out this form and do all these papers, and they're putting all these demands on me. And if I've had a history of trauma, it might be harder to do that because I can't think, because I'm always in this state of kind of fight and flight, or I'm in this kind of reactive mode. So the reason we kind of share this information is not to make everybody depressed or make you feel like, oh, I don't want to have to hear about this. It's really to help you come from a place of empathy, so this is what I can expect is potentially happening. And so that's, I think, the respect and the empathy, and then saying, I have unconditional, I just have positive regard. I know that, good positive expectations, and I'm here to be there for you. I'm not going to judge you in any way is really important.
Right, thank you. And helping fathers to understand and make sense of their experiences is critical. When you think about like what an intentional behavior is, it's called into question when you think about the effects of trauma. Because I know for myself, I would behave and react in ways that I didn't even understand a lot of the time. But one thing you pointed out that's so important, Sam, is when I had my daughter, I witnessed a lot of violence growing up. And I made the decision, I was helped to understand that because of that, there could be the potential to use corporal punishment inappropriately with her. So I made the decision as a parent to never put my hands on my daughter in that way. And so it's bringing men to these types of understanding about their parenting that is just, what you both do is so crucial.
Could I mention one more thing before
sure.
I think sometimes when dads present and they may appear to be under the influence, right? I think it's important for people to really understand that that may be actually the case, but what are the conditions that were established or created that cause somebody to feel like I need to self-medicate, right? Because you don't want to feel bad all the time, right? You need a relief from all this stuff, and you try to find things that are accessible for you, right? And to be promiscuous in drug use and sexuality and all those are things that relieve stress, right? It may not be the healthiest thing, right? But it is they are the kind of things that people use because those things are most accessible. So how do we make, for example, drug treatment more accessible to counter it, right? Fatherhood programs can't be all things to all people. So those partnerships that we need to layer on, whether it's Joe has a relationship with a Sam who's a clinician, a mental health provider, a substance abuse treatment provider, employer partners, right? All those partnerships are absolutely essential to serve the whole dad so that dad can be the best he can be for his child or children.
Yeah, thank you. That's great point. So I'm going to invite the audience to please enter your questions in the chat. We're approaching the Q&A portion, and while you're doing that, I'll just pose one more question to Joe and Samantha. What is trauma-informed care, and how do you frame trauma-informed service delivery for organizations or programs who don't have clinical expertise or training on how to do it? Samantha?
So the way I kind of think of it as a pyramid. I think at the base, well, your organization has to have resources and supports, but I'm going to go kind of hop up a level. And the first level, and Joe is probably going to be able to describe examples of this, is really about the relationship and having a trusting, empathic, caring relationship and how you approach your work with the dads. This is one in which we've kind of spoken to this. And when you were saying, Joe, when you were describing a dad who might come in who seems to be using, or there are some things that their behaviors that are relieving stress, the way to approach something like that might, if you're focusing on relationship and focusing on a supportive relationship, might be not, or have you been using, I can't serve you, but it's, I'm really worried about you because I see you, it seems like you might be using, and that's a sign to me that things are not okay for you. So it's this caring, supportive relationship is at the core. And then, and Joe, you've spoken to some of these things. I think of kind of creating a safe space, which is really about giving people a sense of control, because when you've experienced trauma, you feel a complete lack of control. Creating safety, the things that you do, and that involves emotional safety as well, which is an interesting conversation to have when we're talking about men who traditionally their emotions are not, there's not room for emotions. And then this kind of regard for the individual. And then I think higher up, it's just how you support people in being able to manage their emotional reactions and letting people know that it's okay. I used to work with kids, 4 and 5-year-olds, and these were kids who had experienced trauma. And there was this message that they would get that it's not okay to be angry. I'm a bad boy if I've been angry, or it's not okay for me to be sad. And the message is, it is okay. Just you have to be safe, and you have to know how to be angry in safe ways. And you have to know how to be sad in ways that keep you safe and others around you safe. So I think that applies even to grown-ups as well.
Yeah.
So
great, thanks. Joe?
Yeah, I mean, Sam said quite a bit there. I would compliment what Sam has said by, particularly for practitioners who have existing operations, that you think about who are your external partners that can help you bring internally the kind of trauma-informed training that all of us should, at this point in time, all of us should have that access to that type of training. And, I can tell you there are university partners who have team members who have expertise in trauma training that you should be reaching out to, asking them. And I can tell you that they are more than willing in most cases to provide it gratis, right? You need to have those conversations. You need to invite those kind of folks in, have them sit in your fatherhood groups as appropriate, so they can understand the context in which you need help around. Thinking about how you engage philanthropy. You know, all of us need operating resources to run our programs. You know, we have overhead, we have other things that are critically needed to be able to provide services in the community. But have conversations with your existing funders and prospective funders about the need to have trauma-informed training, right? The cost associated. Do a little bit of your homework. Reach out to those folks who provide that training. Get some sense of what cost estimates are. Start to have conversation with your philanthropic partners, your university partners who can do it gratis, others who may charge for it. But, you know, coming back to the sense of how do you make sure that organizationally you know who works for you, right? I can't tell you over the years, as much as I love certain people, I've had people that have worked in our organization. I wouldn't want to be around a person who's experiencing trauma because they think that they know everything about what a person's going through. And sometimes they overlay what they think uninformed, right? That re-traumatizes people. So just being aware of what in your environment, you know, who are you working with? How do you make sure from a professional development standpoint, your organization across the organization, it's not just for the programmatic team. These are for people who work in administration. These are people who are at the entry gate when a person walks in the door.
For managers.
Yep.
Yeah, a great point. The point of this session was not to make all of you trauma experts. The big point is put practices in place, universal precautions that help to ensure that you won't re-traumatize men or anyone that you serve. You know, people with their best intentions sometimes, Joe can speak to this, man up. Like, we don't want to be telling men to man up. Everything happens for a reason. I have people tell me that. I couldn't make sense of it. There's some big higher power that allowed this to happen to you for a reason. I can tell you there's no reason that a child should ever be hurt or harmed. So, Joe, would you like to comment on that from a programmatic point of view?
Yeah, I think, you know, as a male, as a man, I think we've all experienced that sense of, you know, if a little boy falls down, you know, you pick him up and tell him to dust himself off and keep going, you know, that, and we perpetuate that, and, you know, as men evolve and develop, you know, over the age spectrum. But I can tell you that we really need to think, you know, hard about how we communicate to dads around the sense of man up, because all too often in our society, you're considered weak if you ask for help. And what we don't want to do is perpetuate that sense of, if I ask for help, then I'm going to be looked at as less than. We want to create more opportunities to lift dads up to say, hey, you know, if you fall in, you know, we need to think about how we can support you. And the other, you know, sort of like at the macro level of this, we really have to think hard about our schools of social work and other allied health training to make sure that as helping professionals are coming through those institutions, they are developing competencies in terms of how to engage men in general within the family context, and dads in particular. I can't tell you how many social workers I know, including myself, got no real training on how to address the needs of men as it relates to being a helping professional, because we thought about this in the context of family, which is usually mother and child centric, which is okay, and it's the right thing for us to do. But a family does typically include mom, dad, and their offspring.
Great. We're getting some questions in. James is pointing that out to me. Thank you, James. So from one participant, just one thing to note regarding father's trauma. In addition to the variables referenced so far, for males who have experienced trauma from a former partner and co-parent, it is often hard for males who are abuse victims to find a supportive space for an open environment to work through that experience. Do either of you have any input about that? Men who are, because we know couple relational violence is common now, and we also know that women are becoming increasingly more violent all the time. So how do you address that with men effectively? Sam, you want to start? I think you're on mute, Sam.
Oh, I've been on not mute the whole time, so sorry. I hope I wasn't making noises in the background. It just brings to mind this notion of man up, that, you know, you can't be hurt by somebody physically or emotionally. And so I think it is really important to acknowledge it and find a space for guys to bring that to the table. And again, also there is some level of expertise potentially, and so I think for practitioners who are not clinicians, it's somebody mentioned in the chat listening, and I think that's really important. It's kind of, I think as practitioners, you just think about your stance or your way of interacting, your mindset, and it's starting with from a place of, I want to hear from you. What is your experience? What's important to you? What do you care about? And so that's connects to the topic of men who have experienced domestic violence themselves or any other kinds of traumas, so that people feel heard first. And that it's kind of a mutual, we're sharing this is, I'm here to support you, and it's a mutual endeavor. And I'm not necessarily the expert, you're the expert in your life. I think that's another important part of your stance, that I'm here to listen so I can learn about what your life is and your expertise in your own life, and then find a way to connect you to resources. And then this is maybe too much of a psyche term, but I really like it is holding hope. You're the person who holds the hope for people. So people might come in and feel really hopeless, and you're going to hold that for them, because eventually they're going to be able to take it for themselves and have hope for the future. So it's kind of a nebulous idea, but I think find a way to come to the relationship with that stance.
That's beautiful. That's so true. Beautiful. Thank you. Joe, do you have any comments about that?
This makes me wish, Stacy, that Lisa Nitch would be home with us, right? Lisa, yeah. For the audience, Lisa Nitch is a long-term fatherhood advocate who happens to be one of the most competent domestic violence providers that I know of. And I'll be honest with you, I'm a Black guy and Lisa is a white woman. And we would go at it in terms of her advocacy for women in abuse and me for dads who were trying to do the right thing. And we developed this relationship, that's now been 20 years. She's now the head of training for the House of Ruth, Maryland. And over the years, our relationship has helped inform the way that both organizations approach making sure that women are healthy and their children are healthy and safe, but at the same time recognizes that as much as we want sometimes women to leave a relationship because it's unhealthy, many times they go back to the relationship, right? And conversely, sometimes it's the reverse kind of abuse. And so we need to be in partnership with one another, not adversaries. And so the way in which we think about this, the House of Ruth is at historically has been at all of our fatherhood programs as a universal approach to making sure men understand, what it means to, have hope, families healthy and safe. And then how do we provide services that are consistent with what the family needs, whether it's the woman or the child who needs to be safe, and the guy needs some support around his behavior, or if it's the reverse. And I think this comes back again to having the right kind of partnerships with the right kind of trusting partner that that you can introduce your families to, so that when they receive services, it's mutually beneficial to the organizations, and more importantly, it's mutually beneficial to the families we serve. And in this case, dads who often don't have a place to go if there is some kind of physical abuse that's taking place within that relationship.
Great, thank you. That we have to end now. I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but there are groups created for each session in the virtual collaborative community. So we will address your questions in there. And thank you to the participants who jumped in to answer some of the questions. You've all been wonderful. This has been a great 2 days. Sam and Joe, thank you so much for all of the time and effort you put into helping build this session. It's so important, and we learned so much from you. It's been wonderful.